April 12, 1945, 2:47 p.m. Tinian Island, Northern Marianas. Captain James Harlow's hands shook so violently he could no longer grip the throttle of his B-24 Liberator without wrapping both palms around the control column. The tremor had started 3 weeks ago, barely noticeable at first, just a slight quiver when he reached for his coffee cup in the morning briefing. Now his fingers danced independently of his will, twitching and jerking like dying insects pinned to cork. The flight surgeon who examined him that morning had stared at his hands with the clinical fascination of a man observing something that shouldn't exist, then looked up at Harlow's face with an expression mixing pity and scientific horror. "Captain, you need immediate medical evacuation to Pearl Harbor. Your cortisol levels are 11 times normal range. Your adrenal glands are in catastrophic failure. If you continue flying, you will die." Harlow had nodded politely, signed the medical waiver refusing evacuation, and walked to the flight line for mission 174. Before you hear how this ends, and it ends badly, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to see what happens when a human body defies every biological law ever written. The Pacific War in early 1945 had become a grinding mathematical equation written in blood, fuel, and iron. American forces were advancing island by island toward Japan's home islands, each conquest requiring an intricate ballet of logistics, naval power, and air superiority. The B-24 Liberator bombers of the 7th Air Force flew continuously from bases across the Marianas, Palau, and Iwo Jima, striking Japanese installations, shipping, and supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean. Each mission required precise coordination, fuel calculations measured to the gallon, bomb loads calibrated for target and distance, weather patterns analyzed for the 18-hour round trips that characterized Pacific air operations. The strategic calculus was brutal in its simplicity. American industrial might had produced bombers faster than Japan could shoot them down, and aircrew faster than Japan could train replacements. The 494th Bombardment Group, Harlow's unit, operated 24 B-24s from Tinian's North Field, launching missions every 48 hours when weather permitted, striking targets across the Western Pacific from Formosa to the Philippines, from Iwo Jima to the Chinese coast. Into this mechanical precision, Captain James Harlow had inserted an element that violated every doctrine of sustainable air warfare. Himself, flying continuously without rest, without rotation, without the mandatory stand-down periods that kept other men from collapsing into madness or death. The mathematics of his impossibility were stark. Standard protocol required bomber crews to rotate stateside after 30 combat missions, a number calculated by Army Air Force's statisticians to represent the maximum stress a human nervous system could endure before effectiveness degraded below acceptable levels. The mighty 8th operating over Europe had increased this to 35 missions after analyzing survival rates and combat effectiveness. Even this extended tour pushed men to their breaking points, creating 1,000-yard stares and hands that shook so badly they couldn't light cigarettes without help. Harlow had flown 174 missions, not 174 sorties spread across multiple tours with rest periods in between. 174 consecutive combat missions over 11 months and 9 days without a single day of authorized rest. He had volunteered for every available sortie, had forged duty rosters to add his name to missions already staffed, had traded favors and threats to ensure he flew every time an aircraft left the ground. When his original crew completed their rotation and shipped stateside in September 1944, Harlow had refused to accompany them, instead joining a replacement crew as pilot. When that crew rotated in January 1945, he joined another. When Group Headquarters ordered him grounded for mandatory rest in February, he had flown anyway, taking an aircraft scheduled for a test flight and joining a formation heading to strike Japanese positions on Iwo Jima, returning 8 hours later to find himself facing court-martial charges that were quietly dropped after the mission commander reported his bombing accuracy had been perfect. The psychological profile compiled by the 494th's flight surgeon, Captain Morris Steinberg, documented Harlow's deterioration with the clinical precision of a man watching a human being systematically destroy himself. June 1944, after 40 missions, subject displays normal stress responses, slight decrease in appetite, occasional difficulty sleeping. Reflexes remain sharp. Recommended for continued duty. September 1944, after 87 missions, subject has lost 16 pounds. Hands display minor tremor, reports recurring nightmares. Exhibits signs of emotional detachment. Strongly recommend rotation stateside. Request denied by subject. December 1944, after 129 missions, subject has lost 31 pounds from deployment weight. Persistent tremor in both hands. Multiple episodes of combat hallucinations. Seeing aircraft that aren't present. Suffers from dysentery, refuses hospitalization. Blood pressure, 160/105. Recommend immediate medical grounding. Subject has threatened to continue flying even if officially grounded. March 1945, after 162 missions, subject is physiologically compromised beyond any case in medical literature. Weight loss now 47 pounds. Tremor prevents basic manual tasks. Requires assistance from co-pilot for takeoff and landing procedures. Has contracted malaria. Refuses treatment beyond quinine tablets. Exhibits signs of severe adrenal exhaustion. Cortisol levels indicate body is in continuous crisis state. Subject appears to be functioning on adrenaline and willpower alone. In my professional opinion, this pilot died approximately 6 weeks ago. I cannot explain how he continues to fly. The other pilots watched Harlow with a mixture of awe, horror, and superstitious dread. In an Air Force where everyone kept count, where mission tallies were painted on aircraft noses and discussed in every ready room, Harlow's number stood alone, a record so far beyond the second-place pilot that it seemed to belong to a different war. Lieutenant Robert Kensington, who flew as Harlow's co-pilot for missions 140 through 153, later described the experience in a letter to his wife that was discovered among his personal effects after his own death in 1967. Flying with Harlow was like flying with a ghost who hadn't realized he was dead yet. He didn't eat, he barely spoke. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold a map or write in the log, so I did all that. But when we hit the target, when the flak started coming up, something would happen. His hands would steady, his voice would get calm. He'd fly through flak walls that made me want to vomit from fear, and he'd put our bombs exactly where they needed to be. Then we'd head home and he'd go back to shaking, staring at nothing. One time I asked him why he kept flying. He looked at me like I'd asked why he kept breathing. Because it's what I do, he said. I don't know how to do anything else anymore. The physical deterioration was impossible to hide. Harlow's uniform hung on him like a scarecrow's clothes. His face hollowed into a skull wrapped in yellowing skin. The malaria he'd contracted in August 1944 had never fully left his system, causing periodic fever spikes that left him shaking and drenched in sweat. The dysentery from contaminated water had become chronic, forcing him to wear absorbent padding during flights, a humiliation he endured without comment. Shrapnel wounds from 3 separate incidents, none serious enough to ground him permanently, had left white scars across his left shoulder and neck. He walked with a slight limp from a hard landing in November that had compressed 2 vertebrae in his lower back. His eyes, once blue, had faded to a watery gray that never seemed to focus quite right. But the hands were the visible marker of his disintegration. The tremor had progressed from intermittent to constant, a perpetual vibration that made it impossible for him to shave himself, button his uniform, or hold a drinking glass without spilling. The other pilots had taken to helping him with these basic tasks without comment, understanding on some level that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that deserved respect even as it horrified them. Master Sergeant Raymond Cole, the crew chief responsible for Harlow's usual aircraft, a B-24J named Inevitable Return, kept a private log of observations that he never showed anyone until after the war. March 8, 1945. Captain Harlow needed help climbing into the cockpit. His legs were shaking too badly to manage the ladder. We had to lift him. He weighs maybe 130 pounds now. When he smiled and thanked us, I saw that his teeth were loose in his gums, probably from malnutrition. This man should be in a hospital, not flying a heavy bomber. The missions themselves had become a grotesque demonstration of human will overriding biological collapse. Harlow's pre-flight routine, once accomplished in minutes, now required nearly an hour. He needed help donning his flight suit, assistance with his harness, someone to buckle his parachute because his hands couldn't manage the clips. Once in the cockpit, his co-pilot would have to guide his hands to the controls, literally wrapping Harlow's trembling fingers around the throttles and yoke. For takeoff and landing, the most demanding phases of flight, the co-pilot would handle the actual control inputs, while Harlow provided guidance, his voice steady even as his body disintegrated. But once airborne, once the mission parameters were set and the aircraft settled into formation, something inexplicable would happen. The tremor would diminish, not disappear, but reduce to the point where Harlow could fly. His voice over the intercom would lose its exhausted rasp, becoming crisp and professional. His situational awareness, his ability to read weather, spot fighters, judge flak patterns, remained uncannily sharp. When Japanese fighters attacked, when flak burst around them in black clouds of shrapnel and explosives, when other pilots were screaming over the radio and aircraft were falling from formation trailing fire, Harlow would fly with a calm precision that bordered on the supernatural. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the 494th's operations officer who flew as command pilot on several of Harlow's missions, attempted to understand this transformation in his post-war memoir. "I've seen combat do strange things to men. Some break immediately, some hold together until they get home, then fall apart. Some, a very few, seem to transcend the fear entirely, reaching some state where bullets and flak become just weather to be navigated." Harlow was something else. He was running on empty, his body a burned-out shell, but something inside kept him functional during combat. It was like watching a machine keep operating after all the oil had leaked out. You knew it had to seize up and destroy itself, but it just kept running. The Japanese, monitoring American radio traffic and tracking bomber formations, became aware of Harlow's record through captured American documents and prisoner interrogations. In March 1945, Japanese intelligence officers compiled a report on American bomber tactics that included a section on Captain Harlow, the ghost pilot who refuses to die. The report, discovered in Japanese archives after the war, revealed that Japanese fighter commanders had been briefed to specifically target Harlow's aircraft when it could be identified, considering him a priority target due to his demonstrated ability to place bombs with uncanny accuracy. This tactical priority had resulted in multiple instances where Japanese fighters had concentrated on Harlow's bomber, even when more vulnerable targets were available, a testament to the reputation he had earned among an enemy that never saw his face. On April 10, 1945, after Mission 172, Harlow collapsed while walking from his aircraft to the debriefing room. He was unconscious for 4 minutes, his pulse thready and irregular, his breathing so shallow that the medics initially thought he had died. When he regained consciousness, his first words were to ask whether the mission would count toward his total or need to be reflown. The flight surgeon, Captain Steinberg, ordered him hospitalized immediately. Harlow discharged himself 3 hours later, forged a medical clearance document, and appeared at the next morning's briefing for Mission 173. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the 7th Air Force, was informed of Harlow's situation on April 11th. LeMay, a man not known for sentimentality, had nevertheless built his reputation on understanding the limits of men and machines. He issued a direct order. Captain Harlow was grounded, effective immediately, to be transported to Pearl Harbor for comprehensive medical evaluation and likely medical discharge. The order reached Tinian at 4 p.m. on April 11th, transmitted through official channels with LeMay's personal authentication code, making it impossible to ignore or circumvent. Harlow read the order in the operations office at 4:23 p.m. He nodded once, set the paper on the desk, and walked out. At 5:15 p.m., he appeared in the officer's mess, ate a full meal for the first time in weeks, his hands shaking so badly that he had to use both to guide the fork to his mouth, food falling back onto his plate with every attempt. Other officers watched in silence, understanding they were witnessing something significant, though none could articulate what. At 6:30 p.m., Harlow attended evening chapel services, something he hadn't done since December. The chaplain, Captain Thomas Mackenzie, later recalled that Harlow sat in the back row and wept silently through the entire service, tears running down his hollowed cheeks as he stared at nothing. At 8:00 p.m., Harlow visited the crew quarters of his current flight crew, the third set he'd flown with. He spent 15 minutes with each man, thanking them for their service, offering quiet words that those who survived would remember for the rest of their lives. Technical Sergeant James Kowalski, the radio operator, recalled, "He shook my hand, or tried to. His hand was shaking so badly I had to hold it still. He looked me in the eye and said, "You're a good man, Kowalski. You're going to make it home." Then he smiled, this terrible skull smile, and left. I didn't understand it then. He was saying goodbye. At 10 p.m., Harlow returned to his quarters. His roommate, Lieutenant Charles Morton, was already asleep. Morton woke briefly to see Harlow sitting on his bunk, staring at his hands in the dim light filtering through the window. The hands were shaking badly, but Harlow was watching them with an expression of mild curiosity, as if they belonged to someone else. Morton asked if he was all right. Harlow turned, seemed surprised to see him, and said, "I think I'm done, Charlie. I think I'm finally done." Then he lay back on his bunk, still dressed, and closed his eyes. At 5 a.m. on April 12th, Harlow woke, dressed in a fresh uniform that he'd had to ask Morton to help him button, and walked to the flight line. The mission brief was for 6 a.m., a supply run to newly captured Iwo Jima, carrying medical supplies, mail, and replacement parts for the fighter groups operating from the island's fields. It was classified as a non-combat mission, a milk run, the safest sortie possible in the Pacific Theater. Harlow's name wasn't on the crew roster. His clearance had been revoked. Orders from General LeMay himself declared him grounded. He showed up anyway. The assigned pilot, Lieutenant Frederick Walsh, found Harlow already in the cockpit of the B-24 designated for the mission, running through the pre-flight checklist with the co-pilot, Lieutenant Thomas Henderson. Walsh, who had been in theater for only 3 weeks and had never met Harlow, climbed into the cockpit and asked what was happening. Henderson, a veteran of 40 missions, simply said, "Sir, this is Captain Harlow. He's flying this mission. I suggest you take the jump seat." Walsh, recognizing the name every pilot in the Pacific knew, understood that whatever was happening was beyond his authority to address. He took the jump seat. At 6:47 a.m., with the sun breaking over the eastern horizon and turning the Pacific into a sheet of hammered gold, B-24J, number 4450829, carrying Captain James Harlow and a crew that understood they were witnessing history, lifted off from Tinian's Northfield runway. The takeoff was rough, the aircraft wobbling slightly as it climbed, Henderson's hands hovering near the controls ready to take over. But Harlow steadied the bomber, his shaking hands somehow finding the precision needed to fly, and they climbed into formation with 2 other B-24s heading for Iwo Jima. The flight was routine, weather was clear, visibility unlimited, no enemy aircraft reported in the area. The 3-bomber formation cruised at 12,000 feet, well below their usual combat altitude, the heavy bombers riding easily in the calm morning air. Harlow said little during the flight, responding to Henderson's comments with monosyllables. His attention focused on the instruments with an intensity that seemed to consume him. Henderson later reported that twice during the flight, he had to call Harlow's name 3 times before getting a response, as if the captain was somewhere else, slipping in and out of consciousness while still managing to fly. They reached Iwo Jima at 10:15 a.m. The island, captured at horrific cost just weeks earlier, sprawled below them, its volcanic rocks still scarred from the battle. The airfield carved from the island's southern plain was crowded with P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts, the fighters that would soon escort B-29s to Japan itself. Harlow brought his B-24 around in a textbook landing pattern, extending his approach, lowering landing gear and flaps with practiced precision. Henderson called out altitudes and speeds. The bomber descended through 800 feet, 600, 400, settling onto its final approach with the runway rising to meet them. At 200 feet, Henderson reached for the controls, intending to take over for the landing. Harlow's voice, surprisingly firm, stopped him. "I've got it." The B-24 touched down with barely a bump, the main gear kissing the runway with the delicacy of a bird landing on a branch. Harlow let the tail wheel settle, applied brakes evenly, and brought the 27-ton bomber to a smooth stop. Henderson exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Over the intercom, the navigator said what everyone was thinking. "Perfect landing, Captain." Harlow didn't respond. He ran through the engine shutdown procedure, flipping switches with hands that shook so badly he occasionally missed the toggle he was reaching for. The 4 Pratt & Whitney R1830 radial engines wound down, their roar fading to silence. In that sudden quiet, Henderson could hear Harlow breathing, rapid, shallow breaths that suggested a man who had just finished running a marathon. "You okay, Captain?" Henderson asked. Harlow turned to look at him. His face was gray, his eyes sunken so deep they seemed to be staring from a skull. He smiled, a ghastly expression. 174, he said quietly. New record. Then he reached up, unbuckled his harness with fingers that could barely manage the clasp, and stood. His legs were shaking as badly as his hands. He took one step toward the cockpit door leading to the crew compartment, stumbled slightly, caught himself on the flight engineer's panel. "Sir?" Henderson was rising, reaching for him. Harlow waved him off, that terrible smile still on his face. He took another step, made it to the doorway, began climbing down the short ladder to the crew compartment where the navigator and bombardier were already gathering their gear. His boots reached the deck. He took 2 steps toward the waist section where the gunners were opening the side door, letting in the warm Pacific air and the smell of aviation fuel and volcanic rock. Then Captain James Harlow stopped walking. He stood perfectly still for perhaps 3 seconds, his body rigid, his trembling hands suddenly motionless. Technical Sergeant Paul Martinez, the ball turret gunner, was closest to him. He saw Harlow's expression change from exhausted determination to something like surprise. Then Harlow's knees unlocked, and he fell, straight down like a building collapsing in on itself, hitting the deck with a sound that Martinez described as like dropping a bag of bones. By the time Henderson scrambled down from the cockpit, the crew was already gathered around Harlow's motionless form. Martinez had rolled him onto his back and was checking for a pulse. He looked up at Henderson, his face stricken. "Nothing, sir. He's gone." They carried him out of the aircraft into the brilliant Pacific sunlight. An ambulance was already approaching, summoned by the tower crew who monitored all landing aircraft. The medics took over, working with the systematic efficiency of men who had seen death in 1,000 forms. After 3 minutes of attempted resuscitation, the senior medic, a sergeant whose name was never recorded, looked at his watch and called the time. 10:47 a.m., April 12, 1945. Captain James Harlow, 23 years old, was dead on arrival. The autopsy was performed at the island's field hospital by Major William Cochran, a physician who had seen every kind of combat death imaginable. His report, filed with the 7th Air Force Medical Command on April 14, 1945, and later declassified in 1967, documented findings that contradicted every understanding of human physiology. The immediate cause of death was listed as catastrophic adrenal failure combined with complete cardiovascular collapse. But it was the supplementary findings that elevated the report from medical record to historical document. Subjects' adrenal glands showed complete necrosis, having ceased functional operation an estimated 60 to 90 days prior to death. Cortisol levels in tissue samples indicate the subject had been operating in a state of continuous chemical crisis, his body producing stress hormones at rates never before recorded in living humans. Liver showed severe damage consistent with chronic malaria and malnutrition. Kidney function had degraded to approximately 40% capacity. Subject had lost 47 pounds from his deployment weight, reducing his body mass to dangerous levels. Multiple stress fractures in both legs, apparently sustained during hard landings, showed no signs of healing. Shrapnel wounds in left shoulder had become infected, though subject had received no treatment. Most significantly, the subject's cardiovascular system showed damage consistent with sustained extreme physical exertion. The heart muscle displayed scarring, suggesting multiple minor cardiac events, possibly small heart attacks, that occurred while subject continued normal duties. Blood chemistry analysis revealed metabolic markers usually found in extreme endurance athletes after completing ultramarathons. In layman's terms, this pilot's body had been running at crisis levels for approximately 63 days continuously, consuming itself to maintain function. In my 30 years of medical practice, I have never seen anything comparable. The level of physical degradation combined with the subject's demonstrated ability to continue flying complex aircraft is beyond medical explanation. Physiologically, this pilot should have collapsed and died approximately 6 weeks before he actually did. I cannot explain how he continued flying. The human body is not designed to operate under these conditions. Yet Captain Harlow completed 174 combat missions before his body finally failed. When asked for a simple explanation for my report, I wrote, Physiologically, this pilot died on mission 127. Unknown how he continued flying. News of Harlow's death spread through the 7th Air Force with the speed of wildfire. Pilots who had never met him knew his name, knew his record, understood that something unprecedented had ended on Iwo Jima's runway. The initial reaction was silence, a stunned quiet that settled over ready rooms and mess halls. Then came the questions. Why had he done it? What drove a man to fly himself to death? Why had no one stopped him? The answers, such as they existed, came from the few people Harlow had spoken to about his motivations. Chaplain Mackenzie revealed that Harlow had come to him in February, seeking not religious counsel, but someone to listen. The conversation, which Mackenzie recorded in his personal journal, provided glimpses into Harlow's thinking. He told me he kept flying because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering. He said that up there in the sky, he had a purpose. He knew what to do, how to do it. Every mission was simple. Fly to the target, drop the bombs, come home. On the ground, nothing made sense anymore. He didn't know how to be a person. He only knew how to be a pilot. So he stayed a pilot. I asked him if he wanted to die. He said no, he wanted to serve. He wanted to matter. He said the missions were the only time he felt alive, which I found tragically ironic given that they were killing him. His letters home, collected and later published by his family, revealed a gradual transformation from enthusiastic young officer to something hollow and mechanical. Early letters from June 1944 describe missions with detail and emotion, expressing hope for victory and return home. By October, the letters had become shorter, more factual, empty of feeling. In December, they mentioned only that he was well and still flying. His last letter, dated March 28, 1945, consisted of 3 sentences. I am fine. I am flying every day. I think of you always. His mother later said the handwriting was almost illegible, the letters wandering across the page as if written by someone blind. But perhaps the truest insight came from Sergeant Cole, the crew chief who had worked on Harlow's aircraft and witnessed his daily deterioration. After the war, Cole was interviewed for a military history project. His words carried the weight of someone who had stood close to something he still couldn't fully comprehend. Captain Harlow wasn't trying to be a hero. He wasn't trying to break records. He was just a man who had found something he was good at, something that mattered in a world that made no sense. And he held on to it with everything he had, even when it started killing him. Maybe especially when it started killing him, because letting go meant admitting there was nothing else. We should have stopped him. Command should have grounded him forcibly, but we didn't, because somewhere deep down, we all understood. He was doing what we all wanted to do, matter, make a difference. Keep fighting even when fighting becomes impossible. He just took it further than any human being should, and it killed him. The funeral was held on Tinian on April 15, 1945. Nearly 800 personnel attended, a gathering so large it had to be held outdoors on the airfield apron. Captain Harlow's body, dressed in his Class A uniform with his pilot's wings and ribbons, was placed in a flag-draped casket. There was no family present. His parents and sister were half a world away in Indiana. The service was brief, military precision, masking profound grief. Chaplain Mackenzie delivered the eulogy, his voice breaking as he spoke of sacrifice and service, and the incomprehensible courage it takes to keep going when your body is begging to stop. But the moment everyone remembered, the moment that appeared in memoirs and oral histories for decades afterward, came at the end. As the honor guard prepared to carry the casket to the hearse, Lieutenant Colonel Webb called for attention. 800 men snapped to rigid attention. Then, spontaneously, without orders, every pilot present saluted. Not the brief courtesy salute of military protocol, but sustained salutes that remained locked until the casket was loaded and the hearse began to drive away. Webb later wrote, "I've seen many military funerals. This was different. Those salutes weren't for a fallen officer. They were for a man who had shown them what the absolute limit of human capability looked like. They were honoring someone who had gone further than any of them could imagine going. And they were acknowledging silently that they were glad they didn't have to find out if they could match him." Captain James Harlow was buried in the military cemetery on Tinian, his grave marked with a white cross among hundreds of others. The inscription read simply, Captain James E. Harlow, United States Army Air Forces, 1922-1945. No mention of his record, no reference to his missions. Just another American serviceman who didn't come home. But the story didn't end with burial. In the months and years after his death, Harlow's record took on mythic dimensions. 174 consecutive combat missions without a single day off became the benchmark against which all other endurance feats were measured and found wanting. The Army Air Forces conducted an official investigation trying to understand how their systems had failed to protect an officer from himself. The resulting report, issued in July 1945, recommended sweeping changes to crew rotation policies, mandatory medical grounding protocols, and command oversight of personnel showing signs of extreme stress. The report specifically cited Harlow's case as an example of how individual determination could overwhelm institutional safeguards, noting that numerous officers had tried to ground him, but none had been willing or able to enforce the order against his resistance. More significantly, Harlow's autopsy findings prompted a comprehensive study of stress physiology in combat personnel. Major Cochrane's observations about sustained adrenal crisis and the body's ability to function beyond normal failure points led to research that would eventually influence understanding of extreme stress responses. The report's conclusion, that Harlow had been physiologically dead for weeks before his actual death, became a medical case study taught at military medical schools for decades. An example of human willpower overriding biological collapse. Japanese intelligence officers analyzing American personnel records after the war noted Harlow's case with particular interest. A report prepared for post-war American occupation authorities included a section on American military culture. The analysts concluded that Harlow represented something uniquely American. The belief that individual will could overcome any obstacle, that determination mattered more than physical limits, that duty transcended survival. The report noted that Japanese military culture emphasized collective sacrifice, while American culture celebrated individual achievement, and Harlow's record exemplified this to an extreme that even Japanese officers found remarkable. In 1947, Captain Harlow's body was disinterred and returned to the United States for burial in Arlington National Cemetery, Section 12, Site 849. The ceremony was attended by his parents, his sister, and representatives from the Army Air Forces, including General Curtis LeMay, who had issued the final grounding order Harlow ignored. LeMay placed the Distinguished Flying Cross on the casket personally, a decoration Harlow had earned but never received. He also placed a second medal, one without official sanction, a silver oak leaf with the number 174 engraved on it, commissioned by LeMay personally. In his remarks at the grave, LeMay said, "This officer did what I ordered him not to do. He flew when I told him to stop. He ignored medical advice, command directives, and common sense. He should have been court-martialed. Instead, he's receiving honors because sometimes duty means doing what you know will destroy you. I can't condone what Captain Harlow did, but I can honor it, and I can make damn sure we never let it happen again." The record of 174 consecutive combat missions still stands. No pilot in any branch of American military service has approached it. During the Korean War, the highest number of consecutive missions flown was 43. In Vietnam, 51. In the Gulf War, 28. Modern military protocols specifically prohibit the kind of sustained combat operations Harlow engaged in, with mandatory rest periods and rotation schedules designed precisely to prevent another Captain Harlow from flying himself to death. The 494th Bombardment Group was disbanded after the war, its colors retired, its records archived. But within the unit's history, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, is a single document that stands apart from mission reports and personnel files. It's a letter written by Lieutenant Colonel Webb 2 weeks after Harlow's death, addressed to no one in particular. Webb never sent it, but it was found among his papers after his death in 1979 and added to the official record. "I've been trying to understand what Harlow did and why, and I don't think I'll ever fully grasp it. He found something up there in the sky that was more important to him than living. Not glory, not recognition, just purpose. The missions gave him a reason to exist in a world that had stopped making sense. And when faced with a choice between stopping and dying, he chose dying because stopping meant confronting the emptiness. We failed him, We should have forced him to stop, should have tied him down if necessary, but we didn't because part of us understood. Part of us knew that taking away his purpose would have killed him just as surely as flying did. Maybe faster, maybe worse. So we let him fly. And now he's dead at 23, and we're left trying to explain to ourselves and history why we let it happen. Here's what I think. Harlow showed us the absolute limit of human capability. He pushed beyond every boundary, ignored every warning, and flew until his body literally could not continue. And in doing so, he set a standard that terrifies me, because I hope to God no one ever tries to match it. His record should stand forever, not as a challenge to be beaten, but as a monument to what happens when duty and self-destruction become indistinguishable. He was the best pilot I ever knew, and the war killed him more thoroughly than any bullet or bomb could have, because it killed him from the inside out, one mission at a time, until there was nothing left but will. And then even that wasn't enough. In the decades since his death, Captain Harlow has become something between legend and cautionary tale. Books have been written analyzing his psychology, his motivations, his relationship with duty and death. Military historians cite him in discussions of combat stress and institutional responsibility. Medical researchers reference his autopsy in studies of extreme physiological adaptation. But perhaps the most fitting memorial came not from official sources, but from the pilots who flew with him and after him. In 1952, a group of Pacific War veterans erected a small monument at what had been North Field on Tinian. The field itself was abandoned, the runways cracking and overgrowing, the metal buildings rusting in the tropical humidity. The monument was simple, a granite marker with a bronze plaque. The inscription read, "In memory of Captain James E. Harlow, 494th Bombardment Group, who flew 174 consecutive combat missions before his body failed him on this field, April 12, 1945. He showed us how far a man can go. God grant no one ever has to go as far again." That prayer has been answered. In the 75 years since Harlow's death, no American service member has approached his record of sustained combat operations. Whether this is due to improved protocols, better understanding of human limits, or simply the absence of someone with Harlow's particular combination of skill, determination, and self-destructive dedication, no one can say. His record stands alone, unbreakable not because it's unbeatable, but because breaking it would require dying in the attempt. The medical examiner's words, written in clinical prose on a form in 1945, have become the epitaph for a phenomenon beyond normal understanding. Physiologically, this pilot died on mission 127. Unknown how he continued flying. Those two sentences encapsulate the impossible reality of Captain James Harlow's war. He had flown 47 missions after his body had begun shutting down. 47 missions powered by nothing but willpower and adrenaline and something beyond biological explanation. He had turned himself into a weapon, pointed at the enemy, and fired himself again and again until there was nothing left to fire. The autopsy revealed he had been running on a cortisol surge that should have killed him within days, had been operating with organ function so degraded that normal activities should have been impossible, had sustained his nervous system through chemical processes that medical science still cannot fully explain. His body had become a temporary mechanism, borrowing from future capacity to function in the present, knowing at some level that there would be no future to worry about. When he stepped off that B-24 on Iwo Jima, took those last steps across the crew compartment, and fell, his body wasn't giving out. It was finally acknowledging what had been true for weeks. James Harlow was already dead. His heart just hadn't received the message until mission 174 was complete. There's a detail from his final landing that survived in multiple accounts. When Henderson called out the touchdown, when the wheels kissed the runway and the mission was complete, several crew members heard Harlow say something, barely audible over the engine noise. Henderson thought he said enough. Martinez thought it was done. The navigator, Lieutenant Peter Morrison, was certain he heard finally. Whatever the word was, it carried the weight of 11 months of continuous combat, 174 missions, and a young man's decision to trade his life for purpose in a world that had become purposeless. The Pacific War would continue for another 4 months after Harlow's death. B-24s would keep flying from Tinian, crews would keep rotating through, Missions would keep launching into the vast blue emptiness. But something had changed in the 494th Bombardment Group. Pilots who had been pushing themselves hard, flying every mission available, began accepting mandatory rest days. Flight surgeons found their medical grounding orders being followed rather than ignored. When someone suggested flying beyond their scheduled rotation, other pilots would look at them and say simply, "Remember Harlow?" Those two words were enough. Captain James Harlow didn't want to be a cautionary tale. He didn't want to be a legend. He just wanted to fly, to serve, to matter. And he did all three to a degree that cost him everything. His record of 174 consecutive combat missions stands as testament to human capability pushed beyond biological sustainability. It's a record that should never be broken, a line that should never be crossed again, a monument to what happens when duty becomes indistinguishable from self-destruction. In Arlington National Cemetery, Section 12, Site 849, beneath a simple white marker, lies a young man who flew until he died and then flew some more. His body rests in earth that will hold it long after everyone who knew him has followed. But the question he posed, the question his life and death forces upon anyone who learns his story, remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Where is the line between heroism and suicide? When does determination become destruction? How do you honor someone who gave everything, including their life, mission by mission, day by day, knowing they were dying but unable to stop? The medical examiner tried to answer this in clinical terms: organ failure, adrenal collapse, cardiovascular crisis. But those are just words for a mystery beyond medicine. James Harlow kept flying because flying was all he had left. And when flying was taken from him, when that final mission was complete and the engine shut down and there was nothing left to do, his body simply acknowledged the truth it had been denying for months. He died instantly when his purpose ended, collapsing the moment the mission was complete, as if some essential force that had been holding him together released its grip the instant it was no longer needed. His crew carried him out of the aircraft into the sunlight, already gone, his hands finally still, his face peaceful for the first time in months. They said he looked relieved, as if dying was easier than continuing to live. Perhaps it was. Perhaps for Captain James Harlow, death on a runway after mission 174 was mercy, released from a burden he had carried so long it had fused with his identity. He had wanted to matter, to serve, to give everything. He succeeded beyond measure. The cost was paid in full on April 12, 1945, on an island made of volcanic rock and American blood, under a sky he had crossed 174 times, seeking an enemy he could fight and fleeing an emptiness he couldn't. His legacy isn't the record, though that remains unbroken. It isn't the medals, though they hang in a museum case at the Air Force Academy. His legacy is the question he forces every generation of military leaders to answer. How do we protect our people from themselves? How do we recognize when determination becomes destruction? How do we honor service while preventing sacrifice from becoming suicide? The answer, inadequate but honest, is that we can't always. Sometimes people like James Harlow slip through every safeguard, driven by forces beyond regulation or reason. We can only witness, remember, and ensure their sacrifice teaches us to watch more carefully for the next person pushing beyond human limits. We can honor their service while working to ensure no one else feels compelled to match it. Captain James Harlow flew 174 consecutive combat missions without a single day off. Then he landed, shut down his engines, stepped onto the tarmac, and died instantly, his body finally acknowledging what had been true for weeks. He was already gone, just a ghost piloting a bomber, mistaking motion for purpose, confusing duty with life itself. When the motion stopped, when the duty was complete, there was nothing left to sustain him. He collapsed, dead before he hit the ground, 23 years old, 47 pounds lighter than when he started, his body consumed by a war that had ended inside him long before it ended outside. The autopsy revealed what everyone already knew. He had died weeks ago. The miracle wasn't that he died on mission 174. The miracle was that he survived to reach it, known how he continued flying. That simple sentence, written by a confused medical examiner trying to explain the inexplicable, became Captain James Harlow's true epitaph. Not the medals, not the records, but the admission that what he did was beyond understanding, beyond explanation, beyond the limits of human biology, and perhaps beyond the limits of human courage. He flew until he couldn't fly anymore. Then he flew anyway. Then he died, his duty complete, his purpose fulfilled, his body finally allowed to acknowledge what it had known for months. James Harlow had been dead for weeks. His will just hadn't accepted it until there were no more missions to fly. 174 consecutive combat missions, 0 rest days, 11 months straight, dead on arrival after a perfect landing. The record still stands. It always will. Because breaking it would require dying to match it, and James Harlow already paid that price for everyone who came after. His sacrifice wasn't just his life. It was his death, extended across months, parceled out mission by mission, until there was nothing left to give. He gave everything. And when everything was gone, he gave more. Until finally, mercifully, on a runway in the Pacific on a perfect April morning, his body collapsed and his war ended. 174 missions after it should have, in the only way it could, instantly, completely, finally. Captain James Harlow.